computer. Hey, Josie,
Hi, Deb.
nice to see you.
So
Josie and I just met for the first time on Thursday.
Thursday,
Was it Friday or Thursday?
Thursday this week. Yep.
Thursday, and I got a copy of her book, and I met her for the first time, and I said, I have to have you on the Substack because women, money, and power is very much associated with health, and we'll get into that.
Mhm.
I'm going to read your lovely bio here. So this is Josie, and it says, with my glasses on and the flap flying everywhere. Josie Cox is a journalist who has worked for media outlets in Germany, Switzerland, the UK, and the United States, including Reuters, the Wall Street Journal, and the Independent, where she served as a business editor. As a freelancer, she writes regularly for the BBC and has also written for The Guardian, The Washington Post, Forbes, Fortune, and other publications. Cox was a 2020-2021 Knight Bagahot. Is that how you say it?
Badget. It pretentious
Pageant.
badger with
Okay,
a T.
Knight Pageant Fellow at Columbia Journalism School. She has an MBA from Columbia Business School and is an associate instructor at Columbia School of Professional Studies. She lives in New York City. That's all I need my glasses for. Okay, let's get to the heart of the matter. The first thing I want to ask you is, you're a business reporter, you've seen it all, you've been in all these places where there's lots of white men in suits, and you decide to write Women, Money, and Power. Why?
Good question. Okay, so as you say, I've been a business reporter for about 15 years now, and I feel like every twist and every turn, it's white and it's male, right? And so when people ask me how long, when I started writing the book or what triggered me to start writing the book, it would be a lie to say that I haven't been writing this book for 15 years because I feel like I've been writing it ever since I started reporting on this topic. That being said, in the at the height of the pandemic, I think it was February 2021, I had the opportunity to interview probably one of the most powerful men in America.
Oh,
And I can't tell you.
oh,
I
okay.
wish I could. I wish I could. It was an off the record conversation.
Oh, yes, I read that part. Okay, sorry, yes.
Okay, so this is the prologue of the book actually, but I'll get to that. And I had the opportunity to interview him. I was deep in the sort of gender pay gap reporting space. That was top of mind. And I asked him why he thinks the gender pay gap still exists, particularly at his organization, but also across the broader labor market and the broader economy. And he said to me, he said two things. He said, first of all, what I need to understand is that his organization never pays women and men different amounts of money for doing the same work, right?
You knew that that was not true.
Well, I
Okay.
won't opine on that right now. Nonetheless, he's essentially quoting the Civil Rights Act from 1964 back at me, which I was surprised that he even thought was necessary, but there you go. And then he said to me, the other thing I have to understand is that sometimes when a woman decides to have a baby, when a heterosexual couple decides to have a baby, and a woman temporarily takes a maternity leave to, give birth, when she comes back into the paid labor market, she's sometimes not as professionally ambitious as her male counterpart.
I almost threw this book across the room when I read that. I was so upset.
Yeah, and I was too. I was stunned, and I was actually so stunned that unlike me, I couldn't even muster a follow-up question because everything that had to be said was said, and I knew so much from the response about who this person was and how he runs his company. Anyway, for me, that was the trigger point. I came off that Zoom call, and I knew I had to start writing this book. The question that sort of guided me throughout the whole thing was why, despite the fact that we have been fighting for equality for hundreds of years, that we've had all this immense legislative change in the last 50 years, why do we still have this gaping gender pay gap? Why has it barely moved in 20 years? And why is motherhood still such an inflection point for so many women, particularly as they, embark on their career trajectory?
And what did you say to this man at all? Did you just sort of swallow it and say, okay, I'm going to go do the research right now?
Yeah, I did. I did. It was I wasn't the only person on the call. So a couple of other journalists there. And as I said, everything I needed to know about the culture that he oversaw, that he encouraged at his company, was sort of summed up in the response that he gave me. And what I should say is that, you know, of course, there's an element of truth to what he said. I'm not denying it entirely. I mean, I went freelance when I had my daughter because the circumstances meant that that was the most, you know, the smartest decision for our particular family in that situation. But the fact that that was the first thing he cast for, that his instinct was to essentially place the onus on women's choice, and, you know, not on something that was more systemic or the infrastructure that was not available to women or whatever, you know, anything else would have been better. But essentially he just pointed the finger and said, well, the gender pay gap is simply because women aren't as ambitious as men.
And it reminded me a lot of somewhere in the middle of the book, you talk about the 6 men who are heading these big banks, and they're being grilled by a Black Congress member or senator.
Yeah, correct. So it was a
Yeah.
select committee. Yeah. And it was, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, and they all sat there with their mouths agape without saying or raising their hand when he asked the question, can you see your bank being led by a minority or a woman? And
Correct.
nobody volunteered their hand. Tell me about that.
Okay, so it was a select committee hearing, and I think it was the 10th anniversary of the financial crisis. So it was in 2019. And it was Congressman Al Green who was questioning the CEOs of all of Wall Street's biggest investment banks. So Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Citi, etc. And ostensibly, the hearing was to establish whether these particular individuals had learned from their mistakes and learned, you know, how to prevent systemic risks from seeping into the system. Nonetheless, I'm glad to say the conversation also turned to the homogeneity at the top of America's investment banks. And as you say, you know, Al Green asked this really important question. He noted that the men before him all seemed to be white and all seemed to be male, which they asserted was the case. They actually all, I think I make the point in the book, they all have the same accent except one as well. So, you know,
The Australian, right?
the Australian. And he said, you know, please, I would ask you to raise your hand if you consider it likely that you will be replaced by a woman or a person of color. And no one raised their hand. And again, like, you have to caveat these things because the succession plans at investment banks, particularly when it comes to the CEO, are matters that are shrouded in secrecy, right? They move stock markets. So of course, no one wants to give any kind of clue as to who might replace them, especially if there's only one woman or one person of color in the running, right? That would spark some kind of rumors. But nonetheless, the optics screamed, right? Screamed.
Yeah. So there's another point in the book that I read that really got me thinking. And it was a moment where Michelle Obama is speaking at, was it Harvard Business School, or who was she speaking to?
Well, I think she was speaking, if memory serves, at a reading of her own book.
Yeah, no, right. It was a reading for her book.
Yeah, at the Barclays Center, yeah.
She happened to mention Lean In, which was a huge success at the time that it came out. But I remember reading it and thinking, where's the childcare part of this in here? Yeah. Where's the maternity leave part of this in here? This is all fine and well if you have lots and lots of money, but you can't lean in if the system is not set up for you to do so.
Yeah, exactly.
What did Michelle Obama say? Do you remember?
She said, that shit doesn't work. I think those were her exact words.
Yeah.
And, you know, I commend her for speaking truth, because I actually have to say, when I first read Lean In, I kind of felt emboldened. I was like, yeah, you go, girl. You know, I was in my late 20s. I hadn't had kids yet. I was at the beginning of my career. I was all ready to be ambitious and fighty. And, you know, and then it kind of sunk in. Then I had a kid, you know, then I had to choose between, you know, job and being a mom because of my particular circumstances. And I should say, like, we had a good combined household income, and yet I still had to make that choice. And I just think that the lean in narrative actually has so much to do with that story we were just discussing about the CEO saying that it's women's choice, right? Once again, the lean in narrative coming from a very different direction in the same way places the onus on women to fix themselves in order to fix the problem, which is so systemic. And A, like, is impossible, and B, is unfair, right?
Right. And let's talk about how that leans into, so to speak, healthcare for women. Now, I've written extensively about the fact that when we rely on husbands' jobs to have our health care, and then we get divorced, or when we are artists, or when we are freelance writers, especially in the United States. I mean, now we have Obamacare, but it's getting more and more and more expensive. I mean, my health care these days, I think, is $600 and something a month, which is not bad compared to the $2,400 a month I was paying on Cobra when I got fired from a job back in 2014, and there wasn't any other option to have health insurance. So talk a little bit about how women, money, and power and health intersect.
You know, it's funny. I knew that when I set out to write this book, that there would be an element of health that I would have to include. Like, there was no way around it. What I didn't anticipate was that the topic of healthcare is so intrinsic to pretty much every single chapter in the book, right? Because they are so inextricably linked. And the healthcare, the cost, we can get into that. But just before we do, I just wanted to talk briefly about the second chapter in the book.
Sure, yes.
So it's a chronology. The book is a chronology. It's a history of female economic empowerment, the ups and downs, the setbacks, the progress. I start with the Second World War, the Rosie the Riveters, what happened when they went into the paid labor market for the first time, but crucially, what happened at the end of the war when they were forced out of the paid labor market back into the unpaid labor market, essentially back into the home. And how that kind of trickle down effect, you know, impacted future generations, created resentment that they weren't allowed to talk about, etc. The second chapter in the book is about the 1950s, which were, to my mind, very much characterized by this very quiet fight and project to develop a reproductive healthcare, to develop the contraceptive pill. And I spend the entire chapter writing about how the first oral contraceptive pill was approved by the FDA and who the characters were behind it, who, you know, I often say they were written out of history. That's inaccurate. They were never written into history in the first place, right?
Oh, there were so many names, by the way, and I want to get into that later. There were so many names in this book that I have never heard of before, and they had crucial roles. So let me not interrupt you any further. Go ahead.
No, of course. Anyway, but the conclusion that I drew from reporting that chapter was that the approval of the first oral contraceptive pill was unequivocally the most important development in terms of female economic empowerment of the 20th century. When that pill came out, and I should also say it wasn't immediately available to everyone, but when it first started to become available to many women in the United States, that meant giving them the choice of when they wanted to start a family, whether they wanted to spend time carving out, you know, a space for themselves in the paid labor market before they even thought about having kids. It sort of created this distinction between sex and reproduction, and it was liberating. And I think that is we forget about that. And I think particularly at this time when this god-awful war is being waged on reproductive rights in this country.
Right. And when IVF is suddenly, those are children. And you know, the reason that they're doing that is they're going after birth control. It was always about going after birth control. It's about women's economic empowerment. That's what it is. We're going back to, they want to turn the tide back to the 1950s, back when we didn't have reproductive freedom. They know.
Yeah.
I'm saying they are white males in the Republican Party and white females in the Republican Party. They know that taking away the pill takes away our power.
Yes, absolutely. And that's, you know, that's sort of the strange cycle of my research for this book and the writing process was that I started off very early in the process of researching. I I was writing about 1960 and the approval of the FDA, and this obscure woman, Catherine Dexter McCormick, who has become a personal hero, who really dedicated her entire life to funding all of the research and development into the contraceptive pill. So this story of kind of hope and progress and, you know, braveness and ambition and freedom and independence. And then towards the end of my writing process, when I was about to turn in the manuscript, Rose overturned, right? And it was almost too much for my brain to process. We all knew it was coming, right, at that stage, but it was just, I just couldn't believe that in this day and age, considering all of these women who I've written into my book, who fought and dedicated their entire existence to this cause, and then it's just, you know, six.
So let me ask you something, as somebody who grew up in Switzerland and has a British accent and a British husband, correct? Is your husband British?
Ish, yeah.
British. Does this make you want to run and hightail it back to London?
I mean, it's not going to change anything, right? And I do continue to believe that, you know, the United States sets the pace for other places, good and bad. And, you know, I think that it kind of feels sort of cliched to say this, but as somebody who is in a position to write books like this and who is in a position to produce journalism on this topic, it always feels like a duty, right? To face it and to be here. You know, especially the Roe decision, the Dobbs decision back in 2022, I felt so glad that I was here and that I was experiencing what was going on in this country, because I knew that it would have repercussions everywhere. Yeah.
But you grew up with a different kind. I want to talk about, I know that we're veering a bit off the topic of your book for a second, but having grown up in Switzerland and lived in London, tell me a little bit about the difference between their healthcare system and our healthcare system.
Oh my goodness. I mean, the NHS is fabulous. It's stupendous compared to what's available here. I lived in London for about 10 years. I grew up in Switzerland to a mom who was from Czechoslovakia, a father who was originally British, very multicultural family. We grew up way out in the countryside, studied in the UK, briefly worked in Germany, and then spent 10 years in the UK. And, you know, I mean, just as an example, I had a problematic pregnancy. I had no amniotic fluid. I had a breech baby. I had a C-section. It was complicated. I didn't pay a cent.
Right. And I paid $9,000 per baby.
Yeah.
Not covered by insurance.
Yeah.
Back in 95 and 97.
Right.
And I don't even remember what my 2006 baby cost. It was more than that. It's probably 10,000 at that point. All right. I've veered off topic. What I really want to ask you about too is, can you name a few of the women that are in your book that I've never heard their names? You know the ones I'm talking about. And just tell us a little bit about their lives, because I just feel like if we start talking about these women, we will write them into history.
Yes. Okay. So I have to first come back to the woman who I just mentioned a minute ago.
Sure.
Her name is Catherine Dexter McCormick. When she died, very few obituaries were written about her, but those that were written about her might have mentioned that she was one of the first women to graduate from MIT in 1904. There's so much more to her story than that, but that in itself should be reason enough for us to know her, right? So she grew up she's from the Midwest. She grew up in Chicago. She married into a very wealthy Chicago family, the McCormicks. She married Stanley McCormick, who was heir to a harvesting equipment empire that is still known today. And pretty soon after they got married, he developed very severe schizophrenia. Catherine became obsessed with this idea of what would have happened if she had had his baby and if she had passed this disease down to the next generation. And so as a result of that, she became obsessed with this idea of birth control. She then crossed paths with Margaret Sanger, who, of course, many of us do know, as a highly problematic early pioneer of birth control, but also a champion of eugenics, and which has to be acknowledged, you know, loud and clear. Nonetheless, Catherine and Sanger did a lot of work together. And in 1947, Stanley, Catherine's husband, died, and she actually inherited about $15 million from him, which at that time made her one of the wealthiest women in the US. Again, no one's ever heard of her, right?
Was it $15 million back then or $15 million in current money?
$15 million back then, which I haven't done the inflation calculation, but I'm sure that's a ton of money. So she ended up using that money, long story short, to pretty much single-handedly fund all the research and development that went into making the oral contraceptive pill possible and to get it approved in 1960. Now, it is a very complicated story. The ethics of the trials ahead for that pill were unthinkably horrendous at times. And a lot of the people who worked on the development of that pill had, pretty horrible motives for doing so, Margaret Sanger included. But Catherine, I spent a lot of time in archives. I read a lot of her diaries. I read her textbooks. The MIT has an amazing collection of all her biology textbooks when she was doing her studies up there. And from what I can tell, she truly wanted to develop this pill in order to give women freedom over their own lives and independence. And I have absolutely no doubt that she is one of the most important women in our collective fight for economic empowerment.
Her name ever.
Right. Now you have.
Yes. One more example. So there was one woman that you talked about. Her last name was Bourne, and she's screaming from the rooftops about credit default swaps and derivatives market and how that was going to destroy the economy. And then lo and behold, guess what? It destroyed the economy. And I love Christian Lagarde's comment that if it had been Lehman sisters instead of Lehman brothers, maybe this wouldn't have happened.
Maybe, exactly. Brooksley Bourne was amazing. I do want to talk about her, but I also want to talk about one other person. But I'll talk to you about Brooksley Bourne very quickly first. So she was the head of a pretty obscure agency, government agency called the CFTC, which is the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, which is the sort of nerdy agency. But she was beyond brilliant. She was highly intellectual, very academic. She was a lawyer. She'd been a partner at her law firm at a time when women just weren't really partners at law firms. And she saw the risks that would eventually lead to the financial crisis. And she talked to Larry Summers about them. She talked to Alan Greenspan about them. And they basically said, quiet down, sweetheart. Yeah, don't worry your pretty head about this. And sure, as we all know, it didn't turn out the way that Alan Greenspan and Larry Summers thought it was going to. It turned out exactly as Brooksley Bourne predicted it would. Another remarkable woman. But I did just want to very briefly talk about Pauli Murray, who people might actually have heard of. They should have heard of. There was a wonderful documentary about her a few years ago. But essentially, she was a legal scholar. She was a civil rights activist. She was born in 1910, and she was one of the first people to really talk about the intersection of race and gender in a legal context and in a social context. She was the first Black woman to earn a law degree from Yale Law School. And she also co-founded the National Organization of Women, which is often credited to Betty Friedan, but she actually did it with Betty Friedan. And I was researching the National Organization for Women in the context of the women's movement, in the context of Betty Friedan, the feminine mystique, all of that. And when I was reading the articles of incorporation for now, I saw Pauli Murray's name and I thought, who is this Pauli Murray? And she was, she was amazing. There's actually a book about influential women in America, and the author says that when we reflect on the 20th century, all roads will lead to Pauli Murray, and I think that's absolutely right. She collaborated with the late Supreme Court Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. She was just unequivocally one of the most important characters in both the civil rights movement and the women's movement. And last thing I'm going to say about her is that there's a portrait of her that was recently unveiled at the Yale Club in New York. And now I am not a member of the Yale Club. It might surprise you. I did not go to Yale, but I recently got the opportunity to go into the lobby because I really wanted to see this portrait for myself. And I took a picture of it and I put the portrait on social media. And lo and behold, Pauli Murray's niece got in touch with me.
No way.
Yeah. And so yesterday, actually, I spent 2 hours on a video call with Pauli Murray's niece. Rosita is her name. She's 82. And she told me all about Aunt Pauli and how Aunt Pauli had taken her to Hyde Park to hang out with Eleanor Roosevelt.
Wow.
And it's just, I just, I can't understand why her legacy is not everywhere in New York City, and in North Carolina, where she also lived, and beyond.
Well, what I think about, I mean, the importance of this book and why I wanted to highlight it is that a lot of these stories are untold. And when we start telling those stories, I think that is an important first step. But the end of the book, you actually end with some hope. Tell us a little bit about your hopefulness, because I'm not very hopeful right now, and I want to have a little bit of your optimism rub off on me.
Okay, I like the fact that you mentioned that, because this is sort of like a behind the scenes book writing story, but I initially submitted my manuscript without that last chapter.
Okay.
And when we were editing the manuscript, the feedback that I got was, is there anything is there anything out there?
Oh my God.
Yeah. And it was a really difficult decision for me, because like you, I feel deeply pessimistic about the times we live in.
Me too.
This assault on reproductive rights, this marginalization of women, a mainstream culture that still objectifies women, undermines them, questions their credibility, gender pay gap,
Pays them less.
right? Yeah, but it's sort of everything. And I often talk about this gender authority gap, whereby women's credibility is questioned more readily than men, blah blah blah. I mean, I could go on. So, hope is not something that comes easily, but what I do in that chapter is that I pinpoint all the things where progress, however small, is present, right? And one of the examples I talk about, I spent some time with this lady. Her name is Ashley All, and she is a campaigner in Kansas. And in August 2022, just a few months after the Dobbs decision, Kansas had a vote on whether to enshrine abortion in the right to getting an abortion in the Kansas Constitution. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, Kansas is a deeply Republican state. At the time of that vote, registered Republicans actually outnumbered registered Democrats 2-1. And it was also, a sort of stronghold of the anti-abortion movement. The Summer of Mercy, there are some horrible, horrible stories about attacks on abortion rights activists. And yet, despite all this, and thanks to Ashley All's brilliance and strategic genius, the vote passed, and abortion has now been enshrined in the Kansas Constitution. Now, I never wanted this chapter to say, if Kansas can do it, anywhere can do it. That's not the point. But the point is that what Ashley and her colleagues did was have conversations with individuals that were rooted in common values and common respects and empathy. And she managed, through those conversations, to get people to understand that reproductive rights are human rights, that they are healthcare, fundamentally that they are healthcare. And just that, it's in the economic interest of a state and a country to allow women to have control over their own bodies, right?
Yes. Again, I'm not hopeful, but I will try to remain hopeful in the midst of what we are going through right now.
And to be fair, I do call the chapter Hope or Something Like It.
Or
right?
something like
There's
that.
a caveat. There's a caveat there.
Yes. So briefly before we end this, what's new on the horizon for you? I know you're about to launch a book, but is there another book that you're dying or chomping at the bit to write?
Well, I feel like there are all the books that the women in history who we don't know about. Sorry, I'm going to start that sentence again because grammatically I went off track.
Okay.
There are so many women in history who should be written about. So as somebody who wants to do that, my work is never done.
Right. That's great. You'll die writing about women. I would like that. Yes, exactly.
I believe I will. Hopefully not anytime
Not
soon.
soon, not soon, right. No, but I love that idea of
Yeah.
dedicating your life to highlighting the unsung heroes of
Right.
the women's movement. So who's
Yeah.
the next woman then?
Well, that would be telling, but I do have
Okay.
someone in mind. I do have someone in mind. But you know, the last thing I'll say is that I think that the human stories of the women and men who have fought for this throughout their lives that have not been told, hearing them makes us realize that in many ways we're undermining their legacies,
Right.
right? And I think that that is so powerful. And if that's not an engine for progress, then I don't know what is.
That is
Right.
a fantastic place to stop. Josie, thank you so much. It's Saturday. I know it's a beautiful day outside. I really appreciate that you took time out of your weekend to speak with me. Stay on. I'm going to press stop on the recording. Stay on for a second. We'll have a quick talk.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you so much.
Going to stop recording.